Well, thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited to be having this conversation. I think many of us are still trying to make sense of the election. Others of us have processed it, but we wanted to do a few things today. First, we wanted to help make sense of what just happened and what it means for your business, employees, customers, industry, etc. Wanted to discuss the language that got us where we are, messages that thrived while others faltered, and really learn from all of that and see how we can apply it to our lives. We're going to talk about some of the key moments that everyone's going to remember, and then finally, we're going to talk about the impact this election is going to have on all of our businesses and the opportunities ahead for us to engage and change conversations as we're moving forward. So, thank you all for joining. Looking forward to a great conversation. So, the first thing I want to do is talk about making sense of the election outcome. So I know that there's a lot of lessons of communication we're going to talk to, but I want to ask each of you guys, each of my partners here, to share a little bit about what you think the biggest takeaway was from the election.
Well, all right. Easy. We should be able to distill it down. I'll just say thanks to everyone for joining. Looks like we've got a great group on here. And also, if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat as we go, and we'll try and tackle them. But I think, my if I had to take my one big takeaway, it's that in the battle between facts and feelings, that feelings won this time, as it almost always does in an election context, and that a lot of the a lot of the support for Kamala during the election, and then some of the complaints after the election were that people weren't paying attention to the facts. There was a lot of disinformation or misinformation about the facts, that if you took an objective view of how the economy was doing, of whether people in states in the middle of the country were actually being affected by immigration, if you looked at the data on inflation, that the only conclusion that you could draw objectively from a fact perspective is that the Biden administration and Harris were doing a great job, and they deserved, another term in office. And then on the other side, I think, were the feelings, and the feeling that the economy is a feeling, and the feeling for many people was that the economy was not great. And immigration, I think, in many ways was a feeling that there was this open border that was allowing people to come in, that even if it wasn't affecting people, the feeling was that other people were being prioritized over them, over Americans. That and on so many other things, that there was just this feeling on the side of President Trump. And in every election, it is the side that captures the feeling, the zeitgeist, that wins. It is never the side that has the best facts on their side. We say that to clients all the time, right? The facts will not set you free. That was certainly true here, and I think an important takeaway from this election.
Yeah, I want to build on what Michael said. And first of all, thanks to everybody for joining, and glad we're doing this. I still have anxiety from my years at the White House and never really leave, so I might as well put it to good use. Listen, I think the lesson for businesses coming out of this, as Lee said, we're all trying to make sense of it, is that you better have extraordinary clarity about what your customers want, and find the message that works, not decide what you want to say and see if it lands. I mean, we heard Vice President Harris say repeatedly, we're not going back. And part of the problem was, as we found out, that people did want to go back. They wanted to go back, not necessarily to some of the chaos of the Trump years, but in their mind, when they felt more economically secure. And, people often feel, to Michael's point about feelings, they feel powerless to make change. They don't control their pay. They don't control their hours. They don't control whether their insurance company is going to cover their claims, or whether their train's going to show up on time. But they do get to control what they care about. And what they cared about was what I think was really a cost of living crisis election. And, President Trump said, Harris broke it, I'll fix it. That was his closing argument. And people cared about the economy, and they cared about immigration. And Vice President Harris, in the short time she had, obviously a very difficult spot for her really start campaigning in earnest with 100 days to go. But her campaign was part about opportunity economy, and that didn't feel very tangible to people. Reproductive freedom was a big reminder about Trump's dictatorial fascinations, but it just wasn't what people needed to hear. And I think we saw some of the fury in rallies and so forth, but there was also a fury right underneath the surface that people had, that they just did not feel good about the economy. And it goes back to the same two bedrock points we talk about with our clients all the time. It's not what you say, it's what they hear. So you better know what they're hearing. And you can have everything else right. And Harris had a lot of things right. But if your words don't resonate, it's not going to matter.
And we're all kind of heading in similar directions here. We've been talking about, and I've been saying since 2016, that Donald Trump, for whatever you think of him, has been a great diagnostician during this period. He has identified in a very specific way challenges that a lot of Americans are feeling and that clearly resonate with his identification. It feels like there are a lot of Democratic strategists and politicians and voters out there who have horrible memories, because this was in 2016. This was 8 years ago, ended 4 years ago. And the Democrats did not key into that. They continue to think that there's got to be some other America out there, and that's the America that's going to get us back into the office. This was a change election. And the idea that the Harris campaign was unable to go in that direction, embrace that, and tell us what that change was, is something that was a huge negative for that side. And yes, we know the arguments that, well, she's vice president of a sitting president. If the Democrats were serious about democracy being on the ballot and about the risk of fascism, you got to do better than, oh, but I can't disagree with the sitting president, and move away from there. The time was to take the gloves off and to say, how am I going to make change? Here's how I'm going to make change. Not a thing that comes to mind that she can think of that's going to make change. It's a change election. She did not run as a change candidate.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the biggest questions that I've been getting since is, so the polls got it wrong again.
Mhm.
And I actually say the polls did not get it wrong again. I think we can all find polls that are going to reinforce what we want to hear. And so in the days leading up to the election, we saw that poll come out from Iowa, and people were holding on to that, saying there's this big voter block that we don't know, the silent Republican. It's not just that's going to vote for the Democrats. And there was all of this. Donald Trump had never performed better in the polls than he did in this election. He was ahead nearly the entire way. Kamala had 2 amazing weeks, but then he led in almost every swing state, and he won, and he was leading in the popular vote right up until the day of the election and in the averages. And so while I think the polls were off a little bit, it was within the margin of error. And I think we saw the writing on the wall, and we didn't want to see it. And so I think one of the big lessons for me is that we have to listen, not for what we want to hear, but what the voters, our customers, and the world is telling us around us. And right now, the world is telling us around us that they don't like the way things are going. They don't like the way the government is run. They don't like the way business is done. They don't like the food that we put in our body. They don't like the way that they're being forced into what they want to do. And they've said loud and clear what they want right now. And it's going to be interesting for all of us how to incorporate that into our jobs and actually engage. I'm really encouraged in this moment right now because I'm seeing more people having conversations. 2016, it was like you've got to walk away from the table and it's, you've got the enemy. I was really encouraged when I saw this morning, Morning Joe and Mika were talking about how they went to Mar-a-Lago this weekend, and it's time for us to start having these conversations. So despite the fact that I think there was this tough lesson to learn, I think there's a lot of promise ahead.
Well, I mean, I think I agree with everything you said, but I think it was still a very close election. I think it was a coin flip up until near the very end, and the question was, what percentage of the population was kind of firm in their decision that a that a convicted felon is somebody that they cannot vote for versus the percentage of the population that was convinced that the Biden administration had made policy decisions that were kind of fundamentally wrong and hurt them economically, and that at the margins, which side of the line were you going to fall on? And that for a lot of people, I think it was a very close decision, that there really were a lot of swing voters in this race, a lot of people who didn't make up their minds until the very end, whether that was weeks before the election, days before the election, or in the booth. And that from a polling perspective, every one vote that flips from one side to the other is a two-person flip, right? I mean, it's and so all of a sudden, if you get a small shift in the vote, it ends up showing up as a reasonably large number of people from a margin perspective. I think, what's the final number going to be, like around 2% that he won by?
Less.
Like if polls could get actually within 2%, which is actually 1% margin of error on the performance of either candidate, it'd be pretty extraordinary. They're not set up to do that, particularly in a race that is this kind of fluid as this one was. And so I don't think blaming, which you were not doing, Lee, I don't think the polls were really wrong. I think we could have been having a very different conversation, today, talking about the things that, went the other way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much they would have drawn, kind of changed our fundamental conclusions about what the right thing to do for each candidate would be, but it could have easily gone the other way.
Yeah. So let's dig in to talk a little bit about the lessons that we can learn about communications from all of this. I think this year's campaign, like many, serves as a masterclass for all of us in communication. And there's a lot of insights that we can glean from both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, no matter which side of the aisle you're on. And I think that the truth of the matter is a lot of the success of this campaign came down to some language and some storytelling and some lack of language that we want to talk about. So I'd love to know from you guys what you think is one key insight that you wish everybody on this call would take away, a lesson from the campaign trail.
Yeah, for me, Vice President Harris was leaning into this idea, understandably, that Trump was unhinged. Unhinged, unstable, and unchecked. Those are the three U's that her campaign was trying to get to stick. And I think really a lot of the shock value was gone. It just didn't work, including what happened after the last election with the January 6th insurrection and the felony convictions. It may have mattered to some degree, but ultimately it didn't matter, because what mattered most to people was their own lives and the economy. And I think even though it was a close election, as you guys had lined out, what really stood out to me was how much Trump made gains across America. Even though the ultimate margins weren't that big, he made gains in 90% of the counties in America. He made gains among young voters and older voters and union voters, voters with college degrees, without college degrees. It really also stood out to me that he outright won the Latino male vote. Hillary Clinton won that by 31 points just 8 years ago, and now Trump won it by 10. So that's a 41-point swing in 8 years. And what that says to me is that there really was this diversity in the election of how much people wanted to go in the other direction. And Trump, despite all of his many language flaws, he does have a consistency. In 2016, it was, we all remember, and we still see Make America Great Again, but one of the corollaries of that was he was the champion of what he called forgotten Americans. And I think at that time, it was largely built on the white vote. But what we saw in this election was that a lot more people felt forgotten. Even if Harris won overall, he made a lot of gains, which made a difference. And I think, Lee, inside that, there's a lot of derisive terms that we're now thinking about differently. The whole way that polling is done of college educated versus non-college educated, it's sort of, I saw a lot of coverage that segments people, like non-college educated is somehow less than, where Trump up. Once you get past flyover country, well, flyover country is most of the country. There's like these dismissive terms that I think go to a lot of people's sensibilities, and they felt more heard by Trump than Harris, and they wanted to be seen and they wanted to be heard, and I think they let it be known.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly.
Yeah, I think that in terms of lessons learned that we all might be able to apply, there's something we deal with all the time in our own agency here at Ms. Landscape Partners and with our partners, just around the human tendency to see the world in a way that kind of tends to assume that the world sees the world in a similar way. There's a cognitive bias called false consensus effect, which pretty much ladders up to that. And it's not about not being a smart marketer. It's not about being a smart in this instance kind of political operative. It's a human tendency. It is very hard to get around, and it's one of the things I think we find the most gratification in working with our clients to help get around, just because we're on the outside. We don't have those same rose-colored glasses because we just have to work somewhere else. But building on, Ben, what you said, the focus on who mattered to which campaign in this cycle was just fascinating, and it goes back actually several cycles for the Democrats. We talk with our clients in the business world about swing voters. We talk a lot about swing voters, and we're not talking about the same people that CNN and Fox News are talking about. We're talking about, for you as a company, who are the folks that you are both interested in and have an ability to sway one way or the other. You're going to have the people that love you. That's great. Probably most of your resources and your spending are not going to be to convince them to use your services because they're already doing it. You have the people that will never buy from you. That's great too. Where can we actually invest a hit? And what the Democrats have done over the last several cycles is, in my mind, and I used to work in Democratic politics, an insane lack of looking at their swing voters, because their swing voters, yes, Pennsylvania, yes, North Carolina, but they keep treating like Latinos as a group. One, of course, that's insane. They're not a group. It's a bunch of people who happen to come from a background that is incredibly diverse as well. African Americans as a group, even the working class as a group. And there have been a lot of assumptions made on the Democratic side of, oh, of course, they're with us, right? But the concept that you wouldn't look into more closely those groups in terms of what do they actually care about? What do other Americans care about? A lot of similar things. Let's look at how to communicate to folks. So I think that there was a weird blind spot in terms of really saying, not who do we have to be reaching out to as much as how do we have to be reaching out to them as well in ways that are gonna bring them along. Now, yeah, that said, I would say to Ben, I also am wary about this idea of shifts, because the media and the pundits and the pollsters, everybody loves saying, oh, look at where the country has moved, until another election and then another election. And then, oh, look at where the country has moved. And it's often contradictory. After Obama won, the idea was the Republicans are in huge trouble. They'll never win another national race again. Right. So I think part of this is it's an election. This is what happened in this election. How can we think through strategically, but also in terms of what the context is, to have a different effect? Sorry.
No. I was just going to say, I mean, I think it feels like you were actually agreeing with Ben before you said you
I
were
often do.
Just because, I mean, I think if you say like they were treating Latinos and the Black population as a monolith,
I was agreeing on that point.
But actually, they're not a monolith. They have moved. There are significant proportions. Just a study I read this morning about the percentage of Latinos who don't rate don't consider being Hispanic or Latino very important to their identity, and they were much more likely to vote for Trump than for Harris. And I think that idea that that there are certain populations that were treated as monoliths and not really understood in the world that they're operating in today, and that what maybe the economy and having a job is actually more important than my identity, which I may be third generation, fourth generation, or I may be frustrated at the fact that I earned my way in, and now somebody's coming behind me. Very legitimate kind of perspective to have, and to look at immigration as something that isn't fair to me and my family because of how we got here. But I think it's also, the idea of kind of what the challenge was that Harris had to overcome was, I think, we talk a lot about the fact that old narratives die hard. And I think in addition to the incumbency narrative, Keith, that you were talking about earlier, which I think she would have had to run much harder against, the other negative narrative that Kamala had was a negative narrative as an extreme liberal. And it's been interesting to me to watch what has happened from her defenders who said, well, she didn't campaign on these issues in 2024, or she said she now supports fracking. The interesting thing is, though, while that may be true, she certainly did not do enough to overcome the baggage that comes with a negative narrative, right? And so we see, I'll go to Wells Fargo, which was a great example of a situation that we worked on for many years, and they apologized once, and then they said, "We're done. We apologized. How could you not have accepted our apology?" And that all of a sudden now you should take that one moment and move forward into kind of a different future. And it didn't work that way. It never works that way. And I think the same thing is true here, where you had Kamala Harris had developed this reputation as being far to the left, and even though she changed her position and articulated a new position in some cases, she never forcefully disavowed her old positions. She never explained, why she changed those positions, or really left them in the rearview mirror in a way that would allow her to overcome the negative narratives. And so when the ads started coming out that showed her on camera defending transgender transitioning in jails, it was a really powerful ad that tapped into this old narrative and kind of reinforced it. And any work that she may have done, or any campaigning that she may have done on other issues, couldn't compete with the fact that the evidence kind of that reinforced this old narrative was so strong that if you had to think about who was Kamala Harris today, I think people who weren't paying that much attention were much more likely to be persuaded by the ads, and I don't think it's unfair for them to have been persuaded as much as such.
And hilariously, not hilariously, but on the other side, there was 100% different reality, right? Now, in 2016 and well before, Donald Trump announced to the world, "This is who I am." Like it or hate it. And he continued with that, to the extent that more recently, when there was the Madison Square Garden rally and there was all this blowback, and people are like, "Oh, it's the nail in the coffin for his campaign," this was not a wild divergence from what most people expected from Donald Trump and folks around him, not defending, not doing anything to that, except saying he is anything if not consistent with who he is, not with his policies. He's kind of a little all over the place, but that's who he is. And nobody who was going to vote for him, who ended up voting for him, was shocked at that. Nobody.
Yeah. I think, there's a few lessons and to build on different threads that you all put down there. I think there is something about tying into something bigger that's really important. And you talked, Ben, I think, about the forgotten man, the flyover states, that there was something that Donald Trump really focused on there that tapped into a truth that exists, that there's these forgotten Americans that people don't have faith in or believe in anymore. And he didn't just talk about them, he talked about this idea of fairness. And so much of his messaging framed around this idea is the system is rigged. It is unfair. Whether you think about the economy, it's unfair. When you think about immigration, it's unfair that some people come here the right way and some people get the wrong way. And there's some people getting handouts that you're not getting, and that your cities are getting worse. And he tied into this. And then he positioned himself as an answer to this problem about fairness, which is, I am here to fight for you. They're coming after me because they're coming after you, and I am the one that's going to fight. And I think that was so powerful, not just because he did it, and stood up, fight, fight, fight right after the assassination attempt, but because that was his narrative. He tied into this zeitgeist that's something that was very, very true. All of us right now in business, there's huge narratives about us. One, profits before people. There's truths that people have about us that we have to deal with and figure out how are we going to navigate them. I think that's one big lesson that we all need to learn. The second thing is we're never going to win by telling people they're wrong. Kamala Harris went out there and tried to say the economy's never been stronger. So has Joe Biden. She went out and tried to say every financial services firm, every economist rates my plan better than his plan. Inflation isn't bad, it's fine. Nobody believed it because it wasn't their truth. We're entering in a world right now where we have RFK Jr. maybe going to be the head of Health and Human Services, and we're going to be starting to talk about all kinds of things. Are we going to win these debates by telling them they're wrong? Absolutely not. We have to understand what people are really concerned about, their safety, their security, that companies are putting profits before people. And we need to understand that truth if we expect to win. Another thing that I think we really need to learn is that we've got to make problems solvable. Kamala Harris and Joe Biden use this term all the time, threat to democracy. It was huge and scary and unwieldy, and it was hard to even get your arms around. When Tim Walz came along and started calling Donald Trump weird, and Kamala Harris had this moment where she said he's an unserious man with serious consequences, those attacks made the problem solvable. So how do we make these things, these big attacks, solvable? And then the other big lesson I think we all need to remember is when there's a question that people have about you, you need to answer it or you cannot pass go. Michael, I know you talk about this all the time about the whole addressing the underlying concern. People's underlying concern about Kamala Harris is the economy to them feels bad. Right now, it's the Biden-Harris administration, the Biden-Harris economy. What are you going to do differently than what's happening right now? If you can't answer that question, you don't get to pass go. So what are the questions that people are asking of us that we need to address so that they'll believe us and buy anything that we have to say? And I think those are some of the big lessons for me.
Well, I think you're wrong, Lee.
That never worked ever, Michael.
No, it does not work. Ben, were you gonna?
Yeah, just that, we can't overstate the dynamic at play in this particular election with Harris becoming the surprise candidate so late in the campaign. And I don't think that she missed the feeling that voters have or the need to address it in a way that wasn't just academic statistics and everything you mentioned. I think she felt, my sense was a inability to look straight in the camera and say, I get it. It's a terrible position to have to choose between your rent and your groceries. That's the entirety of this election. Here's exactly how I'm going to fix it in these 3 ways. In the first 100 days, this will help you with your home. This will help you with the gas bill. This will help you with the grocery bill. And I'm sure as hell going to do it better than Trump. And here's why. And the reason she couldn't do that is because to do that would be disloyal to President Biden. It's like, as Keith said, she can't be the change. She's in office. And so I think that there was a moment there when she became the nominee that she always felt like she was sort of pushing up against what she wanted to say or what she could say. And so it felt like a half measure.
I think, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
No, I was just, I think I blame the Biden administration for that a lot, that his legacy depended on her being able to throw him under the bus for one thing. It didn't have to be 10 things.
Right.
But it had to be one thing. And the fact that there was no sacrificial lamb where she could say, you know what, we fought it out like crazy on this and I lost, but I'm going to do it differently. I think was a real, had a really negative impact on how she was perceived.
But see, Michael, I would build on that and say there's a way to do it without throwing Biden under the bus. And I think we talked about this at our last one, last conversation about the election, which is you could have done this sort of 2-step process. When Joe Biden and I took over, country was in disarray. We had COVID, the economy, despite the fact that it had been strong going into COVID, was in shambles. We had to stabilize it and stabilize everything. Phase 2 is about growth. And that's what we're about to go into. And she could have done it that she could have done it, but she finally got close to that at her speech in the Ellipse. And
Mhm.
she did that. And I thought it was a very, very smart way of doing it, that she framed it up. I think the sad thing for her is that her Ellipse speech and that speech got stepped on by Joe Biden's garbage
Yes.
comment,
Yeah.
and then Donald Trump coming out with a garbage truck.
Yeah, but I don't. I mean, I think that
And it was too
that would
late.
have been much better answer than what it was. But I still think that you know, we like the idea of having a vulnerability, that like he was so perfect that there was nothing that she was going to do differently, that they could point to, that they could find, that was either innocuous in hindsight. It feels like it's so easy to have been such a dramatic miss in not having done it. There's one other thing that I think is, uh, um, kind of unrelated to this last point, but I think really important, which is that as we talk about kind of what Trump did so well with the forgotten man, kind of, or the forgotten person in America, is that I think the left, to their peril, fundamentally underestimates how difficult it is for many, and I'm going to say white men who live in flyover country, and white women and white families. And this is not to kind of figure out where everybody fits in line, but that there is this battle that I think is like fundamental, which is what I would say is the used to haves versus the never hads, right? And the never hads is the marginalized communities that in the traditional Democratic coalition, who have never had a seat at the table, and they're fighting for it, and they should, and they deserve to be treated equally and get their fair share. At the same time, got a lot of people who are not in those communities who feel like maybe they used to have more power, maybe they used to have more privilege, maybe they used to have more respect. We asked a question in our responsible business work of whether people thought that other people were trying to shove their opinions down their throats, or whether they were respected less than they were in the past. 90% of Republicans think that they are respected less today than they were in the past, and that other people in this case, meaning the left, are trying to force opinions down their throat. And that is it's a pretty dangerous kind of situation to be in if you need some of that population to be part of your coalition.
Totally.
So
such an important lesson for everybody to take away.
And that's why I mean, just to lead both on what you and Michael were saying, people talked a lot about, oh, where is Harris's sister soldier moment, right? Where's her symbolic stake in the ground of change, of difference, of I actually hear those 90% of Republicans who feel that they are not respected. And so I actually would go further than your excellent speech just now to say that she needed something that was more extreme, because we are living in an extreme moment where the context was extreme, right? And Trump's success is about his ability to credibly say, I am not bringing more of the same. And I love him or hate him, nobody believes he's bringing more of the same. He was able to credibly come forth and say, this is change. And I went back and looked at presidential slogans since Carter. Anybody remember Carter? A leader, comma, for a change. Great line, because he was coming after Nixon and Ford. A leader, comma, for a change. Reagan. Anybody remember Reagan? Let's make America great again. That was Reagan's line. Didn't start with Trump. That was Reagan's campaign line. The again piece, right? For people for a change was Clinton. Change we can believe in, and we probably all remember who talked about that. This was a change election, and she didn't bring the change, but I think she needed to put that stake in the ground. And we talk to our clients a lot about how it can feel like in your own communications, you are signaling that difference, that differentiation, that value. And we end up having these interesting conversations with folks about, no, but we changed this word, we use this word, and see it's very different from these other folks. No, we have this new. For folks to actually hear you, who are expecting more of the same old, as Michael was talking about with his kind of narrative, you need to really push into it frequently 10 times harder than you think you do for folks to be like, oh, and then you need to repeat it 100 times so that they actually start to get it. And I mean, yes, we're not here to beat up on the Harris campaign. They didn't have any time. They were in a very tight spot. And obviously there are a lot of complexities that are going on there that we're not touching on nor probably aware of, but you need to do that from a communications perspective to have any chance of getting traction.
So I think, Keith, you bring up a really good point about you're talking about everybody's slogans. I want to talk about some of the language that was used during the course of the election, whether it was by Joe Biden when he was a candidate or Kamala Harris, or whether it was by Donald Trump or Vance. But I want you to think about all of the significant moments that came down to messaging. And is there anything that you would have either said differently or you think defined and changed the game? So either something that was a big miss or a big win.
Well, go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, as I said, Harris didn't take the opportunity for either loyalty reasons or otherwise to take on the pain people felt economically. It was price gouging and tax credits and opportunity economy. It just didn't matter to them personally. But I also think that there was a fundamental belief that both campaigns had, Lee. Harris was fervent in her belief that she would be a president for all. That ellipse speech he referenced, one of the big moments for her, or she wanted it to be a big moment, was, guys, it doesn't have to be this way. Like, we're the United States of America. It doesn't have to feel this way. It doesn't have to be this way. Remember what happened behind me on January 6th. Like, we can do this together. And believes that strongly. And a lot of people who voted for her do. President Trump, to Keith's point, was never that president. Right? He said it a little bit when he won and kind of had some nice words, but he ran that transgender ad that Michael referenced, and it ended with, she's for they, them, I'm for you. It was specifically saying there are some people in this country that I am not for. I'm trying to get the votes of 50.1% of everybody. And if I do that, I win, and then we all win. And I think that there are specific language moments, but also that underwriting language philosophy of, are you for everybody, or are you picking the people that are going to get you the coalition? And you know, again, Keith, it wasn't that I thought there was a dramatic shift in the country, but he did have these gains. And so I think part of the difference is the way that people are processing this election now, besides the fact that we've had a Trump presidency before, is those numbers make this feel a little bit differently. It can't just be categorized as a white rural surprise vote. There are elements of diversity in this win, even though it was still close. And I think that's part of what America has to grapple with, is that, you know, we have twice voted for someone who has made it a language differentiator to say, I'm for you if you're in this group, not for all. Now, other presidents have won on the all, and we careen. Obama was more the
I want to challenge you on that, Ben, because there were some of those ads where you were absolutely right. He was very, very targeted. There's some of those policies I think that you could argue are very, very different. But he said, I am fighting for all Americans. She tried to say he's fighting for himself. I will fight for you. But I can point to at least 15 different key speeches where his message was about fighting for all Americans. So
I think that history will show, and Trump would say, that his appeal to people that feel forgotten, disenfranchised, left out, angry, was one of fear. This country is not what it needs to be. People are crossing the border. They're eating cats and dogs. They're taking your jobs. We got to get America back. It's just a different way of going about it. And I don't think you could be a candidate around sort of the change of fear, and then say at the same time, I'm a candidate for all. I mean, that's just how I see it.
I mean, the thing that's really interesting is whenever you're talking about, and I don't necessarily want to get in a debate about this in particular, but from a language perspective, I do think that Trump really tried to talk about how he was fighting for all Americans, and maybe all was code, as you heard it, for some Americans. But I think that was his words were often that. And I think that one of the things that we forget and have forgotten when we're talking about this is that every one of those messages that Keith talked about was about change, which means that every time that happened, people were feeling badly. It wasn't that Trump uniquely ran on fear. Everybody in some way has run on, there is a problem that needs to be solved. I or this administration can uniquely solve it and make the change that you need to see. That's not unique to Donald Trump. And I don't think it's unique to any, marketing case or, if you think about market shaping and pharma, we're talking about problems that need to be solved. We're addressing issues that need an answer. And that's not always fear-based. That is actually addressing an underlying need that people have. And I think Donald Trump tapped into that.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that it was, I think you and I have talked about this a little bit about the warm fuzzy. I actually thought the 2016 campaign from Trump was some ways more optimistic than this one. He may have said that a lot. Kamala said a lot of things a lot of times too about what she was going to do for the economy and stuff like that were equally dismissed. I think ultimately he was seen as the more competent candidate to address the problems and identified a clearer set of problems. Arguably hurt himself by overdoing it in some places, but that people who were on the fence at the end of the cycle were more likely to say, you know what, like he's the one who's going to bring prices down because Kamala's not going to do it, or he's the one who's going to stop immigration and Kamala's not going to do it. I don't know that, and then there was his base that I think felt like he represented them. But if you were in that swing late deciding voter, I don't know that either one of them were giving you the warm fuzzies that you were choosing between which one really cared more about you as opposed to which one was more focused on the issues and on addressing the issues that really matter.
Yeah.
And speaking of just the people that matter, we should remind our folks that they can ask questions. We want to hear from you.
You
it's
matter.
Not what we
too.
say. So drop your questions in the chat, please, if you have any.
And you can tell Ben that he's wrong. Or Keith.
I hear it a lot,
but it won't work apparently because that never works. So can I get my language?
Yes, change? You can get your language thing in.
So it kind of builds on what Ben was saying, although I was smiling, Ben, when you were talking about the ellipse speech, because yes, I and Lee, you and I did a bunch of testing a little while ago about the resonance of messages that are honestly, hey, it doesn't have to be like this. Everybody shares some blame for the divisiveness today. Let's bring everybody together. But it's a little ironic that the location of her speech at the ellipse with the capital behind and her using that as a prop was belying the message of, hey, let's all get together, simply because January 6th is, of course, turned into a symbol of Donald Trump, of all these terrible things that could happen, et cetera. And so there was an interesting tension to that. Whereas for the swing voters, the people, again, the actual swing voters that CNN and Fox are talking about, they want somebody who's just going to leave all that stuff behind. Just talk to me about what actually matters to me. But my language shift, Lee, to your question, is away from that, right? Democracy is on the ballot. The fascism focus. Mm-hmm. This has been the democratic messaging writ large from 2015, when Trump became the candidate, until now, has been one or another version of get a load of this guy. That therein does not a campaign make. she didn't have a lot of time, but she didn't take the opportunity she had to say, this is who I am, this is what I'm for and propose to do. And I'll just come back to it because I think it is the critical word of this entire cycle. This is what I am going to change, because I know you all believe change is important to happen and things are broken. And here's what I'm going to change. Not here's what I'm going to do, not opportunity economy, whatever that actually means. Here's what I'm going to change, because that, in this case, conveys more authenticity and seriousness of intent.
Yeah. So actually, I'm going to pivot a little bit just because I know we have about 15 minutes, and I want to talk about change in a way that what we can really expect for what's going to happen now. So Trump said he was going to change a lot of things in terms of who he's going to nominate for his cabinet. So far, he seems to have held true to his promises pretty strictly in terms of the kind of people that he was going to put in and the kind of change that he was going to expect. It has the potential to really upend the way much of our economy is regulated. And I think, I know, Lee, you've been talking to a lot of people on the transition. I think we're seeing in the what happened over the weekend with the two candidates for Treasury Secretary that there's a right way and a wrong way to handle the Trump administration. I think it would be great, Lee, to get your perspective on, at a high level, at least on the transition, what you're hearing and what you think companies ought to be thinking about in terms of how to deal with this new administration.
Yeah. So I think most of you guys that are on probably know, for better or worse, I know a number of people that are either on the transition team or have been named as potential cabinet members. And in my role at, that I play as a commentator on TV, I've gotten to know a lot of these folks and I've been having some conversations. And it's very clear that this team is looking at this election as a mandate for change. And that means RFK Jr. is going into Health and Human Services with the idea that he is going to upend the pharmaceutical industry as we know it. He's going to fight vaccines. There's conversations about what he's going to do around DTC advertising, food ingredients, despite the fact that when he was on his way to the UFC this weekend with Donald Trump, where he had a whole bunch of McDonald's, I think there's a lot of people who are wondering what it means for food ingredients. There's people afraid of, there's all kinds of memes going out there about Diet Coke and other kinds of products and what it means. And I think we've got to look at this very, very seriously. And so for a lot of our clients, we're already having conversations about how can we prepare for this. We've got 2 months between now and Inauguration Day, and they are getting ready to make some big changes. And one thing that I learned for sure is we aren't going to win any of the debates by not engaging them. And we're not going to win by putting all the facts out there that says why they are wrong, because they have their own set of facts. And they just had a vote where they feel like they won on these issues. And so for all of us, whether you're in the pharma business, whether you are in the food business, whether you're in the communications business, whether in financial services, there's going to be some regulation, impact. Some say it's more favorable, but others, all bets are off here. The message that's coming overwhelmingly is we don't want business as usual. We want disruption. And that's what they're planning to do. And so for the topics that are most important to our business, I really think that we need to create playbooks and be ready. And we need to be ready to go sit at the table. I think in 2016, some of our CEOs and some of our folks went into manufacturing roundtables and then left. And there was a lot of protest votes, people that said that they weren't going to engage with this administration. I don't think that's going to be the answer now. I think we're going to have to engage in dialogue and figure out how we're going to engage from both a messaging perspective, because what we're seeing now is Americans have very, very real concerns about how companies are run, how business gets done, and how we make decisions about what goes into all of our bodies. And so I very much expect there to be a whole host of topics that we need to be prepared for, and we've got 2 months to do it. And I don't think we should be caught flat-footed. So it's something that we're willing, ready, and able to come in and talk to you guys about, whether you're at a sister agency or a company that's navigating these kinds of things, we're happy to have these conversations because I think it's really important that we use these 2 months wisely.
Yeah, and I think, it's going to require a lot of different strategies depending on what it is that you are advocating for, who your relationships are with, kind of where you sit politically, but I think that the kind of the full frontal assault on you're wrong and let me tell you all the ways is certainly one that is not going to resonate. I mean, I think that there are going to be issues where aligning with the administration, kind of making your solution big and beautiful and Trump's are going to be effective. There are others where it may be that the strategy is to be the least visible among the targets so that the administration moves on to something that feels like it is a more palatable target. It may be that you have to lean in on certain things that are likely to rally the Trump base in ways that they don't appreciate. I mean, I think tariffs will be a particularly interesting one where all of a sudden, when the reality of tariffs, at least as I understand tariffs, becomes a little bit more clear, who it is that really stands up or stands against them. But there are a whole kind of portfolio of different strategies that are going to be necessary depending on the issue, and really thinking deeply about who the audience is that needs to be reached and how they feel about these issues and what might be persuasive for them is obviously central to what we do, and I'm going to be critical here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think too, some of the questions we're already hearing from clients whose agenda might not match up with the Trump administration's, or we saw a question here about the Republican turn in Capitol Hill as well, is do we need to now, how do we change who we are to meet this new reality? And I think what we're finding and advising a lot of our clients is that who you are is who you are, right? There's a real value in honoring your own values and your identity compellingly, crisply, with a differentiation from the others. You don't have to change who you are, but you do need to, Michael and Lee's point, change how you explain who you are. So one of the core findings of the ESG work that Michael led was people do believe across parties in the underpinnings of environmental social governance work, but not the way it's said. It has become a toxic term, but they care about companies that are materially doing the right thing as long as they are responsible businesses to their communities and to their people. And so changing the way that you talk about the issue that you believe in is really the key. And if you're wondering how to do that, if you don't have those relationships or it feels like a huge leap, we can absolutely help with the how and love to engage in that.
I was typing an answer to the question, but we could take a couple of quick questions too.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't the one I was responding to is what you do more powerful than what you say, or can the right language be so powerful that it overcomes lack of action or the inability to act due to strategic constraints or other operational handcuffs leaders find themselves having to deal with? I mean, I'll give you my take. I think
What were you typing?
I know,
I think we always believe that the kind of the gap between what you say and what you do should be as small as possible. But there are times where you are absolutely constrained in what you can do or in what you can say. I think in the situations where you're constrained in what you can do, there may be a good rationale to explain it that helps you, communicate a commitment or a desire or a perspective that gives you more latitude than your actions will allow. And that there is, we often talk like there is the, what's more important, to have a great story to tell or to tell a great story? And the answer is you need both in most cases. And that action without the right messaging is as dangerous as messaging without action. It is, it's trying to strike the right balance.
And Richard has a great question. I asked this group in virtual forum about 6 weeks ago whether Harris needed to do more to earn her moderate stripes, like a sister soldier moment. And apparently we all hemmed and hawed and said probably not. Fast forward to today and hearing that she didn't do enough to counteract the negative narrative. My own perspective is that her biggest mistake was her comment on The View that we mentioned before about I can't think of anything I would have done differently. And her second biggest mistake was failing to counteract her far left image. Is there something I'm missing, and what should the Democratic Party do to ensure a midterm election yields a different outcome? I would say just to start off, I agree wholeheartedly. And if I was one of the hemmer and hawers, I take the excuse of, hey man, we're just making this up as we go. No, it's great, and I don't actually remember when in the how long she'd been a candidate when we did the last session, whether it was before or after she made the switch away from the forward-looking kind of joy elements to back to bashing fascism and the like. But I would say in terms of your second piece of that advice for the opposition party to around midterms is let's drop the shock. Can't believe this guy. Can you believe what he said now? Can you believe what his appointees said? Can you believe who he did that? That's all fine to feel, but that's not messaging and that's not convincing anybody. I think that over the next 2 years, as it was during his, it's here's what he's doing. What are the results? Is he delivering for you who voted for him? Is he delivering for you who voted for him? And lastly, and I know other people are going to want to jump in on this, let's also keep in mind very much so that midterms are not presidentials. And so actually back to the comment about swing voters and knowing who your voters are, the people who are going to decide the midterms are not the people that decided this election. It's a different electorate. It's motivated voters who come out there, and that's a bit of a different ballgame. Other folks.
I think I just want to go back to this question. I think the biggest mistake that Kamala made was the October 8th The View. She can't think of anything she would have done differently than Biden.
Right. That's it.
It's not about the far left image, right? I think even though that was used to attack her, because I think, as we often say, anything that's left ambiguous is interpreted negatively. And because she didn't give an answer for us to hold on to, we were able to fill it with the answers that we knew to exist to be true when they were held against her. So failing to answer the question actually allowed us to fill in the void with whatever it is that we wanted to. So I think that is something that we really all need to learn, not just politicians. This is just like, so knowing your weaknesses is also really, really important. And her weakness being, that she was too far left, or that, she knew her weakness about her laugh. So she turned that into joy. But I think one thing that we can also learn from Donald Trump is he knows his weaknesses and turns them into strengths. I'm not a bully. I'm going to fight for you. I'm not, I have no political experience. I'm an outsider who's going to go in and blow things up. I'm a businessman who's going to make deals like you've never seen before. You call us garbage, I'm showing up with a garbage truck. Like, there is just no one who is more aware of what the attack is and how to flip it and reframe it. Totally. And that's something else we can all learn from as well.
Yeah. But Richard, good for calling us out. I think we were naive to think that at that point she was setting the terms of the narrative, and it seemed like it could hold. There was no rush to actively change it herself. I think she didn't react to the moments that came her way the way that she should have, whether it was on the View or on dealing with actively rebutting the accusations that she was a moderate liberal, as opposed to just kind of talking about the fact that her values haven't changed and therefore she wasn't a flip-flopper. But it's a good call out.
My final word to those in the opposition party who are not happy right now. Two things. First of all, recent political history has shown that we are not a country of incrementalism, and that in my adult lifetime, we swung from Bush Sr. to Clinton. At that time, it seems like a very long time ago, but that felt like a mini revolution, generationally, geographically, everything. We went after Clinton fatigue. We went back to Bush 43, then to Obama, after people were tired of that time, to Trump, Biden, Trump. So I think that midterms in the middle of a first term have always shown support for the opposition party. But having said all that, I think the most important takeaway is to underscore something Lee said. don't wait 2 years. Don't just build up, your party for the midterms and the presidential and listen to these voters, but engage. This is the new reality. If the Trump administration and the Hill really wants to find a way forward with both parties, there's an opportunity here, but you got to engage them on their terms as much as your own.
I would also just build on that, Ben, to dismiss this belief that exists out there at your own peril. I think we've been dismissive of Americans. We've been dismissive of Donald Trump. We've been dismissive of Trump supporters. We've been dismissive of a whole host of people for far too long, and that's something that we need to figure out. How do we engage with everyone? And this is a long-term movement. It's a long time in the making that we got to here, and it's going to be a long time getting through it. But I think that the good news for all of us is the answer really does lie in communicating through it, not in walking away from it. And I'm encouraged in this moment to see that there seems to be more of an appetite for conversation than there did before. And I think that we all need to engage, no matter where you sit.
Yeah, and I'll just, at the risk of beating up on this, there's a choice that everybody has to make right now, which is like to kind of come to terms with what happened and why. And one way to do it is to look externally and say, well, it wasn't us, it was them, or it's people who are racist or who are misogynist or who are all of these negatives. And I think leaving aside the question of whether or not that's true, or it's true for some people, it's not terribly helpful in winning the next one, if that's your goal. Because really it is finding out what you can control and what you can do better, and where you may not fully understand the people that you're trying to persuade. And that is, I think, what we've all kind of been leaning into, is that there's a misunderstanding of the populace on the left in ways that that allowed a very flawed candidate in Donald Trump to win. All right, we are over. I don't mean to have grabbed the last word, but you all said the smart stuff, so I said the last stuff. And thanks for everybody for joining, and really appreciate the comments. Please send questions or reach out if we can be helpful. We would love to, and more to come. But thank you all, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye.